I'm going to tell you 2 stories about Postman Pat and his friends from Greendale. The first one is called The Floating Postman. It had rained without stopping for a whole week, and on Monday morning it was still raining. "I don't think much of this for summer weather," grumbled Pat. "I'll have to wear my wellies today." Jess liked it even less. He curled his tail tightly round himself as he looked out at the sopping garden. Rain or no rain, the letters had to be delivered. Pat set out in his little red van. All along the valley the streams were full of water as they fell down the sides of the hills. They made white lines as the water churned and foamed. "It looks bad," said Pat to Jess. "Really bad." When they called at the village post office, Mrs. Goggins said, "We'll be having floods if this goes on. Just mind how you go, Pat. We don't want you being washed away. Remember last time we had floods? There's a mark on the church wall to show where the water came to. Miss Hubbard was cut off for a week that time." There was a letter for the Reverend Timms, so Pat asked the Reverend to show him the mark. "Goodness," said Pat. "That would come up to my waist, and I'm not much good at swimming." "The Lord will preserve us," said the Reverend. Further along the road, Pat saw Peter Fogg, and stopped to give him a letter from his girlfriend in Pencaster. Peter was mending the wall, just by the place where a stream goes under the road. "Just look at this wall," said Peter. "That water's knocked it down during the night. It's amazing what it can do." "Watch it doesn't wash you away as well," said Pat. "Oh, I'll be all right," said Peter. "I'm used to it." Pat went on his way. At Greendale Farm, Mrs. Pottage was grumbling about the weather too. "We'd got nearly all the hay in when it started," she said. "There was just one more field to cut, and that's ruined now." "Well, it could be worse," said Pat. "You could have lost the lot." Katie and Tom were not bothering about the weather. They were playing with the farm kittens in the barn and making houses with bales of hay. Off Pat went along the winding roads. Then, "Hold tight, Jess," he shouted, and stood on the brakes. Round a corner, the road came to an end. It looked like the beach at Brighton with the tide coming in. The water lapped right across the road, and 3 ducks were swimming and dabbling in it. "What a mess," said Pat. "Now what are we going to do?" He got out of his van and stood at the edge of the water. The flood stretched along the road as far as he could see. The river had burst over its banks and flooded the whole of that part of the valley. Jess stayed in the van, where it was warm and dry. "I wonder if Ted Glenn ever got round to mending Mr. Pottage's boat," said Pat. "We might be able to get to his place if we go back a bit. It's worth trying." So Pat turned his van round and went to see Ted Glenn. When Pat stopped at Ted Glenn's workshop, he could hear a sound of hammering. "It sounds as though he's busy with it now," said Pat. He knocked and walked in. Ted had pulled the boat in through the barn doors. His workshop had once been a barn, and turned the rowing boat upside down. He had put a new piece of wood in to replace the rotten piece, and given it a new coat of paint. Now he was putting a new seat in it. "Hello," said Pat. "I'm glad to see you getting on with that boat at last." "I thought I'd better," said Ted. "If it rains much longer, I'll be able to row it back to Mr. Pottage, and that lake's getting too close for comfort." "Is that new paint dry?" said Pat. "Of course it is," said Ted. "Well, I have news for you," said Pat. "The valley road's flooded, and I can't get any further. If we could get this boat afloat—" we could get to all the people who must be cut off, and get all these letters through as well.
We can put it on the trailer and tow it down to the water with your van, said Ted. Are you feeling strong? Get hold of that side and lift when I say go.
The boat was heavy. They rolled it over somehow and lifted it onto the trailer. Once it was on wheels, it was easy to move. They hitched it to Pat's van and off they went, with the boat bouncing along the road behind them. Jess looked out at the boat, wondering what on earth it was. When they reached the edge of the flood, Pat saw that the water had risen still higher whilst he had been at Ted's. He backed the trailer up to the edge of the water. Then they pushed the trailer into the water until it was deep enough for the boat to float. Ted loosened the ropes and they felt the water lifting the boat.
It's stronger than us,
said Ted. It's like a hot air balloon, said Pat. You can feel it lifting away just the same, only it's wet.
We'd better take Jess with us,
said Ted.
We can't leave him in the van in case it gets washed away.
Pat went to get Jess. Jess didn't want to go in the boat and dug his claws into Pat's sleeve. Come on, Jess. You'll have to come with us, said Pat. You'll be all right. I'll look after you. He tucked Jess into his warm coat. His black and white face looked out at the water, and he twitched his whiskers and sneezed, but he felt warm and safe with Pat. Pat and Ted rode along the flooded road.
We'd better go to Miss Hubbard's first,
said Ted.
She was cut off for weeks last time we had a flood.
They could see Miss Hubbard's cottage on its little knoll from a long way away. The water had flooded all round it and left it standing on a tiny island. Miss Hubbard was in the garden, in her Wellingtons and a bright yellow raincoat and rain hat, looking out for them. They rowed up to her island and Ted tied the boat up to the gatepost.
Thank goodness you've come,
said Miss Hubbard.
I'm glad to see you, I can tell you. There's a special choir practice at Pencaster Church at 2 o'clock, and I mustn't miss it. Oh, Miss Hubbard, you and your choir practices, said Ted. The whole valley's flooded. You'll not be able to get to Pencaster. Nonsense, said Miss Hubbard. The telephone's still working, and I've had a word with the Reverend Timms. The road to the vicarage is still dry, and he's offered to drive me to Pencaster. He's invited to tea with the bishop. He can't miss that. That wasn't all. She insisted on bringing her bike as well. How it made the boat rock when they put the bike in it. They all squeezed in, and Miss Hubbard helped Pat to row, whilst Ted held onto her bike. They rowed across the flood back to Pat's van. I nearly forgot, said Pat. There are 3 letters for you, Miss Hubbard. Lovely, she said. I'll read them on the way to Pencaster. Then she wobbled off along the road on her bike. I hope she gets there, said Ted. Now, said Pat, I wonder if we can get to George Lancaster's place. There's a parcel here for him, from the vet. It's for that sheepdog of his. It's been very poorly. He'll be needing that really urgently. We can row across the lake, said Ted. Then you can walk up the hill to George's. It'll be a long, wet walk, but it's the only way. Righto, said Pat. Let's be on the way. Thanks for helping, Ted. They rowed across the lake to the nearest point to the road to Intake Farm. They were in luck because George had driven down on his tractor to see if there was a way through the water. He had driven his tractor into the water, but it became so deep that he had to turn back. He was just on his way back when he saw Pat and Ted. Pat shouted, "Hi, George! We've brought your parcel from the vet." George stopped his tractor and waited for them to come close. By Jove, I am glad to see you,
he said.
My poor old Bess is in a real bad way. That's her medicine. It'll put her on her feet in no time. I thought it looked important, said Pat. You haven't got a box of matches as well, have you? Said George. I'm down to my last 3 matches. You're in luck, said Ted. I have some. Catch. Are you all right for food? Said Pat. Yes, we always keep a good store of tins. We'll be okay, thanks, Pat and Ted. I'll see you when this water gets away. Cheerio! Off he went up the hill on his tractor. Ted and Pat rode back across the lake. On the way they saw a goat standing on the roof of a hen hut, trapped by the flood. Poor thing, said Pat. We'd better see if we can get it into the boat. What a struggle they had with that goat. It did not want to go in the boat. It kicked and butted and struggled, and it was strong. It was a wonder they didn't all fall in the water. But they got it in somehow. Ted had to tie its legs with a piece of rope to stop it jumping out again. I'll have to ask Mrs. Pottage to put it in a spare pen until the floods go down, said Pat. It's sure to try to run home if it's in a field. Jess was very cross when they put the goat in Pat's van. He hated sharing his van with a goat, even if its legs were tied together. The goat glared at him in a very fierce way, all the way to Greendale Farm. As soon as she saw the goat, Mrs. Pottage said, "That's Poppy. She's one of Alf Thompson's goats. She's a real devil, always breaking out and jumping over fences and walls. She had no business being down where the floods are. It serves her right. She can stay in our spare pigsty until she can go home, and she'd better behave herself." They carried Poppy to the pigsty and untied her legs. She jumped and frisked about and butted the wooden door, but she could not get out. "Be a good girl, and you can have some dinner," said Mrs. Pottage. "We've brought your boat as well," said Ted. "Thanks for lending it, though you didn't know you were." "That's all right," said Mrs. Pottage. "You're welcome. We'd better keep it ready in case it's needed tomorrow to rescue anyone." Pat drove Ted home. "I think the water's dropping," said Pat, as they looked over the wall at the flood. "And look," said Ted, "the sun's coming out." It was, too. The clouds rolled away and there was a big stretch of blue sky. The sun shone and began to dry up the water. "I hope it's better tomorrow," said Pat. "I'd rather keep my feet dry. Thanks for all your help, Ted. Cheerio." Pat and Jess were on the way home, looking forward to their tea, to dry clothes and dry paws. The next morning the floods had gone down so much that the roads were mostly clear. There was a lot of mud and rubbish everywhere, and some deep puddles. But Pat could get through in his van with a deal of spattering and splashing. Alf came to take Poppy home and give her a good telling off for wandering, just as she was looking forward to a second bucket of Mrs. Pottage's mash. Miss Hubbard stayed overnight in Pencaster. The vicar's wife put her in the best spare room. She did some shopping in town and came home on the Greendale bus, to find that the flood had washed her garden gate away, but nothing worse. "That's another job for Ted," she said. "I'll pop round in the morning. I think I'll have a blue one this time."